patrol lights were already flashing when Darnell Rooker stopped to help. Red and blue glare, his son watching. The officer's hand near her belt. She turned around, and recognition hit. She wasn't a stranded cop. She was Lila Moreno, vanished 14 years ago, now tracking him because 7 minutes connecting cables flagged his name in a federal database tied to an investigation he didn't know existed. The son in his truck? Not his biological child. His nephew, custody taken after his sister's overdose. The biological father was Vernon Coswell, dead in a Little Rock motel during a trafficking investigation. 2 days ago, someone sent proof Vernon's records weren't destroyed. Someone besides federal agents knows where they are. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before the person you helped becomes the one tracking what you've hidden. Because Darnell is about to discover what 14 years of silence can't protect when 7 minutes was long enough for the past to find him. Darnell Rooker stopped to jumpstart a stranded patrol car outside Emporia, Kansas, and the 7 minutes it took to connect the cables destroyed 14 years of safety he'd built by staying invisible. The patrol lights were already flashing when he realized he'd stopped too close, the red and blue glare bleeding across his windshield and filling the cab before he'd fully registered what he was doing. His truck easing onto the shoulder of US Route 50, while his son Malik stirred in the passenger seat and asked through half-sleep why the car ahead wasn't moving. The female officer stood with her cruiser door open, one hand resting near her belt, watching Darnell in the side mirror with an expression he couldn't read from 30 yards away, but recognized anyway as the look that arrived before decisions got made about who belonged on an empty highway at 6:47 in the morning and who didn't. He hadn't planned to stop. That was the part he'd replay later when trying to understand how everything unraveled so quickly. But the road stretched empty in both directions under a sky that hadn't committed to dawn yet. The wind coming off the Flint Hills cold enough to make waiting dangerous and sharp enough to carry the smell of diesel exhaust from a semi that had passed minutes earlier. Malik sat up straighter, 14 years old and already reading situations faster than most adults twice his age. His backpack pulled tight against his chest in that way Darnell had taught him, without ever speaking the instruction out loud. And when Darnell finally stepped out of the truck, he kept both palms raised slightly as he walked forward, calling out in a voice he forced to stay level that he was just checking if she needed help. Nothing more, nothing less, just doing what any decent person would do on a stretch of highway where backup could take 20 minutes, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to make broken-down vehicles into real problems. The officer turned then, pushing her sunglasses up onto her forehead, and the moment Darnell saw her face fully, the ground beneath him seemed to tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the uneven shoulder or the trucks blowing past on the highway. She was Lila Moreno, and he hadn't seen her or heard her voice, or allowed himself to think her name in any sustained way since she'd disappeared from his life 14 years earlier, after an argument in a Dodge County apartment that ended with a door closing and a voicemail that cut off mid-sentence, leaving him with questions he'd eventually stopped asking because Malik arrived 2 years later, and the answers stopped mattering, compared to the immediate reality of a child who needed raising. The air between them changed texture, not dramatically enough for Malik to notice from the truck, but enough that Darnell felt it in his chest like pressure shifting before weather turned. And he saw in the way Lila's jaw tightened that she'd recognized him too, that whatever careful distance they'd both maintained for over a decade had just collapsed in the seconds it took for her to turn around and for him to stop pretending he didn't know her. They spoke only about batteries and cables and the cold, words that stayed technical and empty of history while Darnell worked quickly with the jumper cables, his hands steady despite the fact that every nerve in his body was screaming at him to get back in the truck and drive away before this moment extended into something neither of them could control. Malik watched from the passenger seat, alert now and no longer pretending to sleep, his eyes moving between his father and the officer with the kind of attention that came from learning early how to measure danger in silences and body language rather than words. Darnell was aware of passing vehicles slowing just enough for drivers to look, aware of how the scene would appear from 50 yards away to someone who didn't know the context, didn't know that stopping to help could be more complicated than the simple mathematics of dead batteries and working alternators. Subscribe before you watch someone's past catch up to them on an empty road where nothing was supposed to go wrong. The cruiser's engine turned over, coughing once before catching, and Lila thanked him with words that sounded like they'd been pulled from a training manual, professional and hollow, and careful not to acknowledge anything personal. Darnell nodded without meeting her eyes directly. Already backing toward his truck, where Malik sat waiting with questions forming behind his careful expression, questions Darnell could see building, even from 15 feet away. He climbed back into the cab, pulled the door shut, checked his mirrors twice before easing back onto the highway, and for the first mile, neither he nor Malik spoke. The silence between them, heavy with things Darnell didn't know how to explain, and Malik didn't know how to ask. The officer's cruiser stayed parked on the shoulder as they drove away. And when Darnell glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw Lila standing beside her vehicle, watching his taillights disappear into the early morning traffic with an expression that looked less like relief and more like someone who'd just watched a door they'd locked years ago swing open again despite every precaution they'd taken to keep it sealed. The jumper cables felt heavier than they should have as Darnell connected them to the patrol car's battery, his fingers working through the sequence he'd done 100 times before, while his mind tried to process what was happening in front of him and what it meant that Leila Moreno was standing 3 feet away wearing a Kansas highway patrol uniform and pretending they'd never met. She stayed near the open driver's door, not hovering over him but not walking away either. Her presence maintained at exactly the distance protocol would require between a stranded officer and a civilian providing assistance, and when she spoke it was only to confirm the connection points or mention that the cold had probably drained the battery faster than normal given how long she'd been parked with the hazards running. Darnell kept his responses equally brief, matching her tone exactly, both of them performing a careful dance of professional courtesy that had nothing to do with the fact that 14 years ago they'd known each other in ways that made this current formality feel like a lie. Neither of them was willing to acknowledge out loud. His hands didn't shake, but they wanted to, and he was conscious of keeping his movements deliberate and visible, aware that Malik was watching from the truck and that passing drivers were still slowing to look at the scene unfolding on the shoulder. Lila's radio crackled twice with dispatch checking her status, and she responded in clipped code that Darnell couldn't fully decode but understood meant she was handling the situation without requesting backup, which should have made him feel safer but somehow didn't. The wind kept coming off the Flint Hills in gusts that smelled like frozen earth and carried the sound of distant traffic, and Darnell found himself focusing on these details, anchoring himself in sensory information because the alternative was letting his mind drift into questions about why she was here, why now, why she'd never reached out in all the years since Dodge County. He finished connecting the cables and stepped back, gesturing for her to try the ignition, and when the engine turned over on the second attempt, the sound felt less like success and more like the closing of a window that had been briefly opened. Lila let it run for a moment, then climbed out to help him disconnect the cables, and that was when she looked past him toward the truck where Malik sat watching, his face visible through the windshield in the early morning light. Her expression shifted just slightly, something passing across her features that wasn't quite recognition but wasn't quite neutral either. And she said without looking directly at Darnell that his son looked just like him, the words delivered casually as if commenting on weather or traffic patterns. Darnell's response came too quickly, almost defensive in its speed, a single word that hung in the cold air between them with more weight than it should have carried, and he saw in the way Lila's eyes narrowed just fractionally that she'd noticed the sharpness of his reaction even if she didn't yet understand what it meant. He coiled the jumper cables faster than necessary, his movements efficient, but no longer quite as controlled as they'd been moments before, and Lila thanked him with words that sounded rehearsed and hollow, professional courtesy stripped of anything personal. She said she appreciated the help, and that he should be safe on the rest of his drive, and Darnell nodded without meeting her eyes, already turning back toward his truck where Malik waited with questions neither of them would know how to answer. Subscribe before the moment that should end becomes the thing that follows you home. The cruiser's engine settled into a steady idle, the hazard lights still flashing their mechanical rhythm against the pale morning sky, and Darnell climbed back into his truck with the cable still cold in his hands. Lila stood beside her open driver's door, not moving to leave yet, and in the rearview mirror Darnell watched her watching him, her posture suggesting someone who just solved a puzzle she hadn't known she was working on. And he understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in his chest that this moment wasn't finished, that whatever careful distance they'd maintained for 14 years had just collapsed into something neither of them could control anymore, and that the real consequences of stopping to help hadn't even started to reveal themselves yet. 3 days after the Route 50 encounter, Darnell was unloading drywall sheets from his truck bed outside a renovation job in Salina when a Lyon County Sheriff's deputy approached across the gravel parking lot, one hand resting casually on his belt in that way law enforcement did when they wanted you to notice they weren't threatening you but could be if circumstances changed. The deputy introduced himself as Officer Hastings and said he had a few questions about Darnell's vehicle, nothing serious, just routine follow-up on a report that had come through the system, And would Darnell mind stepping over to his truck for a moment, where they could talk without the construction noise making everything harder to hear? Darnell set down the drywall carefully, wiped chalky dust from his hands onto his jeans, and followed the deputy across the lot while his crew continued working inside the building, unaware that anything unusual was happening, or that the next 10 minutes would shift the ground beneath everything Darnell thought he understood about simple encounters on empty highways. The deputy pulled out a small notepad and asked if Darnell had been traveling on US Route 50 outside Emporia approximately 72 hours earlier, and when Darnell confirmed that he had, the deputy nodded as if this matched information he already possessed, and mentioned that Darnell's plates had been flagged in a database related to a civilian assist report filed by a Kansas Highway Patrol officer. Darnell felt something tighten in his chest but kept his expression neutral, asking if there was a problem with how he'd helped, if he'd done something wrong that needed correcting. And the deputy shook his head and said no, nothing like that, but the report had triggered a cross-reference in a federal database that required follow-up, which was why he was here asking questions that probably seemed unnecessary but were part of a process he didn't fully control. The word federal landed differently than state or county would have, carrying weight that extended beyond routine traffic stops or minor violations. And Darnell asked what kind of database would flag someone for helping a stranded officer. What possible federal interest could exist in jumper cables and dead batteries on Kansas highways? The deputy's expression shifted into something that looked like genuine confusion mixed with bureaucratic resignation, and he said that was the part he didn't understand either, that the flag was federal level rather than state, and he didn't usually see clean records like Darnell's in that particular system, which made the whole thing feel like either a clerical error or something more complicated than a routine follow-up warranted. He wrote down a case reference number on a page torn from his notepad, handed it to Darnell, and said he should keep it somewhere safe and stay available for possible additional questions. Nothing that required a lawyer or formal proceedings, just the kind of administrative requirement that sometimes emerged when reports crossed jurisdictional boundaries in ways that triggered automated protocols. Subscribe before the help you offered becomes the evidence someone else was waiting for. Darnell took the paper and folded it carefully, sliding it into his wallet where it sat next to Malik's school ID and a receipt from the last oil change. And the deputy thanked him for his cooperation and walked back to his cruiser parked at the far edge of the lot. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer, heavy with implications Darnell couldn't yet name. And when he returned to unloading drywall, his hands moved through the work automatically while his mind replayed every moment of the Route 50 stop, searching for what he'd missed. What detail might explain why helping someone had put his name into a federal system that tracked people for reasons he couldn't imagine and didn't want to discover? That evening, driving east on I-70 toward Kansas City with Malik quiet in the passenger seat, the silence between them finally broke when his son asked why police kept asking questions even when they hadn't done anything wrong. Why it felt like every interaction required explanation and justification for existing in spaces where other people moved without being noticed. Darnell kept his eyes on the road, watching the sun drop behind them and paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. And he gave the answer he'd been refining for years, careful and incomplete, about how some people got more attention than others regardless of actions or intentions, how the world worked in ways that weren't always fair but had to be navigated anyway, and how the most important thing was staying calm and cooperative even when the situation felt wrong, because anger only made things worse and dignity required patience that sometimes felt like surrender but wasn't. Not really. Not if you understood that survival meant choosing your battles and protecting what mattered most even when the cost felt too high to pay. 2 weeks after the Salina deputy handed him a case reference number and told him to stay available, Darnell was standing outside the Independence Community Center in Missouri, 370 miles from where the Route 50 encounter had happened, watching Malik's basketball team run through layup drills on a court that still smelled like fresh wax and teenage sweat. He'd relocated them temporarily after the federal database conversation, taking advantage of an offer from his late sister's in-laws, who had spare room in their Independence house and didn't ask too many questions about why Darnell suddenly needed distance from Kansas. And the move had felt like the right kind of caution, even if he couldn't fully articulate what threat he was avoiding, or whether putting state lines between himself and whatever was unfolding would actually provide the safety he was hoping to create. Malik had adjusted to the new school faster than expected, making the junior varsity team within days and fitting into the rhythm of practices and games with the kind of easy adaptation that came from learning early how to rebuild routines without complaining about circumstances beyond control. Darnell had just finished talking to another parent about weekend tournament schedules when he saw Lila Moreno walking across the parking lot toward the community center entrance, dressed in civilian clothes rather than uniform, her stride purposeful, but not hurried. And the sight of her moving toward him made his chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with surprise, and everything to do with the realization that whatever distance he tried to establish by crossing into Missouri hadn't been nearly enough. She stopped a few feet away, hands in the pockets of her jacket, and offered an explanation that sounded rehearsed about being in the area for joint training exercises between Kansas and Missouri law enforcement agencies, about recognizing his truck in the parking lot and deciding to check in after their brief encounter on Route 50 a few weeks back. The words came out smooth and professional, the kind of story that would satisfy most people who didn't have reason to question why an off-duty Kansas Highway Patrol officer would be 300 miles from her jurisdiction on a Tuesday evening. Darnell listened without interrupting, aware of other parents moving past them toward the entrance, aware that Lila's presence here required explanation he didn't yet have. And when she paused, he asked how she'd known this was where Malik played basketball, how she'd known they'd moved to Independence at all. Lila's expression stayed neutral, but something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation happening too quickly for him to fully track. And she gestured vaguely toward the building and said she'd asked around after seeing his truck, that it wasn't difficult to figure out where a kid might be on a Tuesday evening in a town this size. The explanation felt thin, stretched too tight over gaps it couldn't quite cover, but before Darnell could press further, she mentioned that Malik wore number 23, same jersey number Darnell had worn in high school, and the casualness with which she delivered this information, the way she said it without glancing toward the court where the team was visible through the windows, made Darnell's stomach drop, because there was no way she could have known that detail without deliberately seeking it out, without watching from somewhere he hadn't noticed. Subscribe before the person tracking you reveals they've been watching longer than you thought possible. He kept his voice steady when he asked how long she'd been keeping tabs on them, and Lila's response was immediate and deflecting, saying she wasn't keeping tabs on anyone, that she'd simply noticed details the way people do when they're paying attention, and the conversation felt less like reconnection and more like being told something important without the words being spoken directly. Malik emerged from the gym doors then, gym bag slung over his shoulder, and jersey number 23, visible beneath his unzipped jacket. And when he saw his father talking to someone he didn't recognize, his pace slowed just slightly, his expression shifting into the careful neutrality he'd learned to adopt when situations required assessment before action. Lila nodded to Darnell, said she should get going, and walked back toward the parking lot without acknowledging Malik directly, leaving Darnell standing outside the community center, with the growing certainty that relocating to Missouri hadn't created safety but had instead revealed just how thoroughly someone was willing to follow him when they decided his life deserved their attention, and that whatever was unfolding had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with choices made 14 years ago that were finally coming due in ways he'd never anticipated and couldn't yet understand how to stop. That night, after Malik had gone to bed in the spare room at his late mother's parents' house, Darnell sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and thought about all the ways truth could be bent without breaking, all the careful omissions that accumulated over years until they became their own kind of architecture, holding up structures that would collapse if anyone examined the foundation too closely. Lila's appearance at the basketball practice hadn't just been unsettling because of the surveillance it implied or the distance she'd traveled to find them, but because of what it suggested about information she might already possess, details she'd somehow accessed about his life that went deeper than jersey numbers and relocated addresses and federal database flags that made no sense unless someone was looking for connections that shouldn't exist between a man who'd spent 14 years trying to stay invisible and a past he'd worked hard to leave behind. Malik wasn't his son by blood. That was the truth Darnell had carried quietly since the night his younger sister Tanya died in a Johnson County hospital, her body finally surrendering to an opioid addiction that had been consuming her in increments for years while Darnell watched helplessly from the margins, offering support she couldn't accept and interventions that arrived too late to change trajectories already set. The boy had been 2 years old then, confused and crying in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, while nurses tried to explain things in soft voices that made everything feel worse. And when they'd asked Darnell if he was sure about taking custody, if he understood what he was committing to for the next 16 years minimum, he'd looked at Malik and seen his sister's eyes staring back at him from a face too young to understand that everything had just changed forever. The decision hadn't felt like obligation or duty or any of the heavy words people use to describe taking responsibility for children that weren't biologically yours. It had felt like the only possible response to a question that didn't have any other acceptable answer. And in the moment Darnell had said yes, he'd felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with burden and everything to do with choice, with deciding that this child's future mattered more than his own comfort or plans or the life he'd been building before the phone rang in the middle of the night. He'd never told Malik the full story, had let the boy assume a biological connection that Darnell had never explicitly claimed, but also never corrected. And as the years passed, the truth became harder to introduce without feeling like a betrayal of the relationship they'd built. The trust that had accumulated through homework, help, and basketball practices, and the 1,000 small moments that made someone a parent regardless of genetics. But now, sitting in a borrowed kitchen 300 miles from home with the taste of cold coffee in his mouth and the memory of Lila's knowing expression replaying in his mind, Darnell wondered if the silence he'd maintained around Malik's origins had been protection or just another form of avoidance. Another way of keeping difficult truths buried until circumstances forced them into light, whether anyone was ready or not. Subscribe before the secrets you kept to protect someone become the leverage someone else uses against you. The question that kept circling back, the one that made sleep impossible even after he'd rinsed the coffee cup and turned off the kitchen lights, was whether Lila had known about Malik's custody situation all along. Whether the federal investigation she was supposedly part of had somehow accessed records that should have been sealed, family court documents that weren't supposed to be visible to anyone outside specific legal channels. Her comment about Malik looking like him suddenly felt less like casual observation and more like a test, a way of measuring how quickly Darnell would defend a connection that couldn't survive scrutiny if someone decided to look closely enough at birth certificates and custody orders and the paper trail that documented exactly how a 2-year-old boy had ended up in the care of an uncle who'd rebuilt his entire life around the responsibility. If Lila knew, then whoever she was working with knew. And if they knew, then the careful story Darnell had constructed over 14 years wasn't protection anymore, but a weakness that could be exploited by anyone who understood that the most effective pressure points were always the ones people had spent the most energy hiding, the truths that mattered enough to keep secret and therefore mattered enough to use as leverage when circumstances required it. Darnell closed his eyes and tried to imagine what morning would bring, what new revelation or complication would emerge from choices he'd made with good intentions that were now unraveling in ways he couldn't control and didn't know how to stop. And the only certainty he could hold on to was that whatever came next would require telling Malik truths that might change everything between them, and that the cost of protection he'd been paying in silence for 14 years was about to come due in ways that would make the original sacrifice feel small by comparison. The silver sedan appeared first outside Malik's school on a Wednesday afternoon. Parked 3 spaces down from where Darnell always waited during pickup, its windows tinted dark enough that he couldn't see who sat behind the wheel, but not so dark that the vehicle looked obviously out of place among the other parent cars lining the Independence Community School lot. Darnell noticed it mostly because it arrived before him, already positioned with a clear view of the main entrance, and when Malik emerged with his backpack slung over one shoulder, the sedan's engine stayed running, exhaust visible in the cold air, but no one got out, and no student approached it. He loaded Malik into the truck without mentioning the vehicle, but as he pulled out of the lot he watched his rearview mirror and saw the sedan stay parked for another 30 seconds before pulling out 3 cars behind them, maintaining distance that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. 2 hours later, after dropping Malik at the house and driving to a grocery store in Kansas City, Kansas, to pick up supplies he could have bought closer to home, Darnell saw the same sedan parked in the far corner of the lot, same tinted windows, same idling engine. This time he took out his phone and photographed the vehicle from inside the store, zooming in enough to capture the plate number even through the window glare. And when he returned to his truck, the sedan was gone, but the certainty had settled into his chest that whatever was happening had moved beyond coincidence into something more organized and deliberate. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes going through his phone's photos, confirming the plate number matched between the school and the grocery store, and then he made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous, the kind of choice that would either confirm his suspicions or reveal him as paranoid to anyone who might be watching. He drove east on I-70 toward Lawrence, taking exits he wouldn't normally use and doubling back on surface streets to test whether the pattern would hold. And within 20 minutes the silver sedan appeared again in his mirrors, maintaining careful distance but never losing sight of his truck for more than a few seconds at a time. Darnell's hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his pulse had accelerated into the rhythm that came before confrontation, before moments when staying calm required conscious effort rather than instinct, and he pulled into a Love's truck stop outside Lawrence and parked near the fuel islands where the lighting was bright and security cameras covered every angle. The sedan drove past the entrance, continued down the frontage road, and disappeared around a curve that led back to the highway. But 10 minutes later, while Darnell sat in his truck with the engine off and the heater slowly losing its battle against the cold, the sedan circled back and parked at the far end of the lot near the diesel pumps, close enough to watch but far enough to maintain deniability about its purpose. Subscribe before the surveillance you document becomes the proof no one believes until it's too late. Darnell pulled out the business card the Salina deputy had given him weeks earlier, the one with the case reference number written on the back, and he dialed the number printed on the front and waited through 4 rings before voicemail picked up. He left a message that stayed factual and controlled, saying he was being followed by a vehicle he'd documented across multiple locations and state lines, that he had photos and plate numbers and wanted to know why someone with his case reference would be under active surveillance when he'd been told the federal database flag was routine follow-up. He ended the call and sat holding the phone, watching the silver sedan's exhaust rise into the truck stop lights, and then his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Area code 501, which he knew was Arkansas, but couldn't place more specifically than that. He stared at the screen through 2 rings, finger hovering over the answer button, and let it go to voicemail without picking up. The ringing stopped. 10 seconds of silence passed. Then the phone rang again, same unknown number, and this time Darnell's thumb moved toward the screen, not because he'd decided to answer, but because whoever was calling had just made it clear they knew he was looking at the phone right now, knew he'd declined the first call deliberately, and that the surveillance he'd been documenting for the past 3 hours had been mutual all along. The Arkansas number had been Lila, her voice tight when Darnell finally answered on the 3rd ring, asking if he could meet her the next morning at an address in Kansas City where they could talk without being overheard or documented in ways that might complicate what she needed to explain. The borrowed office smelled like old coffee and printer toner, a small windowless room in a building that housed bail bondsmen and immigration lawyers, and the kind of professional services that operated in spaces where anonymity mattered more than aesthetics. Lila had been waiting when Darnell arrived, sitting at a desk that wasn't hers with her hands folded on the surface like someone preparing to deliver news that couldn't be softened no matter how carefully the words were chosen, and when she finally started speaking, what emerged wasn't an apology or an explanation, but a dismantling of everything Darnell thought he understood about the past 14 years and why she disappeared without warning from an apartment in Dodge County on a night when their argument had felt important enough to end a relationship, but not important enough to erase a person from existence entirely. She hadn't left because she was scared of him, or scared of commitment, or any of the reasons Darnell had cycled through during the months after her voicemail cut off mid-sentence, and her phone number stopped working and every attempt to locate her ran into walls that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She'd left because 2 days before their argument, federal agents had approached her with evidence that connected her previous employer, a logistics company operating warehouses across Kansas and Oklahoma, to a trafficking operation that moved contraband through state lines using shipping manifests that looked legitimate, until someone examined the paperwork closely enough to see the patterns hidden in delivery schedules and inventory discrepancies. Lila had been working in their accounting department, processing invoices that seemed routine until the agents showed her how the numbers aligned with seizures that had been made in Arkansas and Missouri, showed her documentation that suggested her supervisor wasn't just aware of the operation, but was coordinating portions of it through channels she'd been accessing without understanding what the access meant. The agents had offered her a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: cooperate as a confidential witness and help build a case that would require months of testimony and depositions across multiple jurisdictions, or face potential charges as an accessory to crimes she'd participated in unknowingly through her regular job responsibilities. She'd chosen cooperation because the alternative would have destroyed any future she might build. But the cooperation came with requirements that included severing all personal connections that might compromise the investigation or create vulnerabilities that defense attorneys could exploit during proceedings that were still years away from reaching courtrooms. She'd been instructed to relocate immediately, to change her contact information, to avoid any communication that might create patterns someone could trace if they were looking for leverage or trying to identify witnesses before trials commenced. The federal agents had relocated her to Kansas initially, and then to positions across Oklahoma and Arkansas as the investigation expanded, moving her like a chess piece that needed protection, while simultaneously being positioned to deliver testimony that would matter when cases finally went to trial. And she'd known about Malik, known he wasn't Darnell's biological son, known because the investigation had eventually connected back to the boy's actual father, a man named Vernon Coswell, who'd been involved peripherally in the trafficking operation through his work as an independent contractor, hauling shipments that originated from the same warehouses where Lila had processed paperwork. Hadn't understood was criminal until agents explained what the numbers represented. Vernon had died 3 years into the investigation, overdosed in a Little Rock motel room under circumstances that were ruled accidental but felt convenient given the timing of depositions he'd been scheduled to provide. And when Lila had accessed case files looking for information about potential threats to the investigation, she'd found references to a child placed in custody with relatives after a Johnson County overdose that occurred around the same time frame. And the math had been simple enough that she'd understood immediately who Darnell had taken responsibility for, and why he'd never mentioned the custody arrangement in the conversations they'd had before everything collapsed. Subscribe before the person you thought abandoned you reveals they disappeared to keep you safe from consequences you never saw coming. She hadn't reached out because reaching out would have created exactly the kind of connection the federal agents had warned her against. Would have put Darnell's name into files and databases where it might attract attention from people looking for vulnerabilities to exploit or witnesses to intimidate. And she'd convinced herself that silence was protection, even when it felt like cruelty. But seeing him on Route 50 had broken something in the careful distance she'd maintained, had made it impossible to keep pretending that 14 years of separation had somehow been enough time for the danger to dissipate or for the investigation to conclude in ways that no longer required her testimony. She was being relocated again, this time to Fayetteville, Arkansas, once the final depositions wrapped and the last defendants accepted plea agreements that meant trials wouldn't happen but convictions would. And she didn't expect to hear from Darnell again after this conversation, because expecting contact would only make the necessary distance harder to maintain. And she'd already learned that protecting people sometimes meant leaving them without the explanations they deserved. The silence that followed her words lasted longer than comfort allowed, heavy with implications neither of them could fully process. Darnell thought about asking questions, about demanding details that might make the past 14 years feel less like abandonment and more like sacrifice. But the answers wouldn't change the fact that she was leaving again, and that whatever brief reconnection they'd experienced on a Kansas highway had only ever been temporary. He stood eventually, thanked her for the explanation without knowing if gratitude was the right response to information that reframed everything he'd believed about trust and protection. And when he walked out of the borrowed office into the Kansas City afternoon, the weight he carried felt different. Heavier with knowledge but somehow clearer about what the past had actually meant and what the future would require if he wanted to keep Malik safe from investigations that could reach backward through custody records to create vulnerabilities where none had existed before. The drive back toward southeast Kansas unfolded in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but wasn't peaceful either. Just the necessary quiet that came after conversations that rearranged understanding in ways that required time to process before words could be useful again. Malik had fallen asleep somewhere past Overland Park, his head tilted against the window, and his breath fogging the glass in rhythmic patterns that Darnell found himself watching in his peripheral vision, grateful for the excuse not to talk about where they'd been or why the meeting in Kansas City had taken longer than expected. The highway stretched ahead under a sky that had committed fully to winter now, the late afternoon, light, thin, and colorless, in the way that made distances harder to judge and made everything feel slightly unreal, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. Darnell thought about truth and how it functioned differently depending on who held it and why they chose to keep it close rather than share it openly. He'd spent 14 years protecting Malik from knowledge that might have changed how the boy understood his own history, might have introduced questions about biology and belonging that seemed cruel to impose on a child who'd already lost his mother before he was old enough to form permanent memories of her face. But the protection had also been self-serving in ways Darnell was only now beginning to recognize, had allowed him to avoid conversations that would have required explaining his sister's addiction and the circumstances that had led to a 2-year-old crying in a hospital waiting room, while adults made decisions that would reshape the rest of his life. Leela had kept her own silence for different reasons, but with similar justifications, had convinced herself that distance was safety even when it looked like abandonment from the outside. And Darnell wondered if all the important truths people carried eventually became this heavy, this complicated, this impossible to share without causing damage that felt worse than the original secret. The question of timing haunted him more than the question of content. The awareness that some truths could wait years without becoming lies, while others spoiled in the waiting and turned into something toxic that poisoned relationships even when finally revealed. Malik would need to know about his biological father eventually, would need to understand that Vernon Coswell had existed and had died in circumstances connected to federal investigations that still cast shadows across their lives 14 years after the initial events. But telling him now, while they were living in a borrowed house 300 miles from home and being tracked by surveillance that Darnell still didn't fully understand, felt like adding weight to a situation that was already threatening to collapse under its own complexity. And yet not telling him felt like another form of protection that served Darnell's comfort more than Malik's right to understand his own story. Another way of avoiding difficulty by postponing truth until some hypothetical better moment that might never actually arrive. Subscribe before the peace you find in silence becomes the void that separates you from the people who deserve your truth. At a rest stop near Fort Scott, Malik woke and stretched, and asked in a voice still rough with sleep if the lady from the road was coming back. The question arriving without context, but carrying enough weight that Darnell understood immediately what his son was really asking. Whether the disruption to their carefully maintained routine was temporary or permanent, whether they'd be returning to Kansas soon or staying in Missouri indefinitely while circumstances beyond their control played out in ways that didn't include their input. Darnell didn't answer right away, taking time to consider what truth would be useful and what truth would only create more anxiety in a situation where certainty was already in short supply. He said eventually that sometimes people did what they thought would keep others safe, even if it meant leaving, and that sometimes staying was the braver choice even when it came late, and that the most important thing was making sure the people you were responsible for understood they were valued, regardless of how complicated the circumstances became or how long it took to explain what had really been happening beneath the surface of events that looked simple from the outside but never actually were. The answer felt insufficient even as he spoke it, too abstract to satisfy a 14-year-old who wanted concrete information about whether their life would return to normal. But it was the closest Darnell could come to honesty, without revealing details that would require explanations he wasn't ready to provide yet. And Malik seemed to accept the vagueness as typical of adult communication that never quite delivered the clarity it promised, settling back into his seat with a nod that suggested understanding, even if it didn't reflect satisfaction with what he'd heard. That night, after Malik had gone to bed, and the house had settled into the particular silence that came after everyone else was asleep, Darnell sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand and tried to figure out what could be said to someone who'd spent 14 years protecting you by staying away. He'd typed and deleted 3 different versions of the message before accepting that there was no way to say what he needed to say without sounding like he was asking for something, and what he needed wasn't reconciliation or forgiveness or any of the things that usually followed conversations like the one they'd had in the borrowed office in Kansas City. What he needed was for her to know that he understood the cost she'd paid for decisions that hadn't felt like choices, that he recognized the weight she'd been carrying alone, while he'd been carrying his own different weight in parallel, and that whatever anger he might have been entitled to feel about the past 14 years had dissolved into something more complicated than anger allowed. The message he finally settled on was shorter than any of the versions he'd deleted, stripped of everything except the essential acknowledgement that seemed like the only honest thing he could offer without pretending he knew what came next, or that next, mattered as much as simply marking the moment when silence stopped, being the only available option. He wrote that he understood why she'd left and why she'd stayed gone, that the protection she'd provided by keeping distance made sense now, in ways it couldn't have when he'd been standing in the apartment in Dodge County, listening to a voicemail that cut off mid-sentence and wondering what he'd done wrong. He wrote that Malik was doing well, better than well actually, that the boy had turned into someone Darnell was proud to know regardless of how the biology had worked out or what complications existed in the background that might eventually require explanation. He wrote that he wasn't asking her to reach out again or expecting contact beyond what professional circumstances might require, but that if she ever needed him to know something, or if the investigation created situations where his silence would be more useful than his ignorance, she could trust him to handle whatever information came his way, without making it harder than it already was. The last part felt important even though he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. The idea that protection could flow in both directions if both people understood what was at stake and were willing to carry weight without demanding acknowledgement or reciprocity. Lila had protected him by leaving, and maybe there would come a time when he could protect her by staying quiet about things he'd learned or connections he'd made that could complicate her testimony or her relocation to Fayetteville or whatever other requirements the federal investigation still imposed on her life years after the initial events that had set everything in motion. The message wasn't about absolution because neither of them were guilty of anything except trying to survive circumstances that had required impossible choices from people who deserved better options. And it wasn't about closure because closure suggested endings, and what Darnell felt sitting in the borrowed kitchen with his phone in his hand was more like recognition that some stories didn't end, but just continued in different forms with different stakes and different understanding of what the earlier chapters had actually meant. Subscribe before the message you send becomes the bridge that connects two people who learn to carry weight alone. He read the message 3 times, making minor edits to words that felt too formal or too casual. And then he sent it before he could talk himself out of the gesture or convince himself that silence was still the safer choice, even when safety felt less important than acknowledgement. The message showed as delivered immediately, the little indicator appearing beneath his words to confirm they'd reached whatever phone number Lila was using now, but the read receipt stayed blank. No confirmation that she'd opened the message or seen what he'd written, or had any intention of responding to words that hadn't really been asking for response in the first place. He set the phone face down on the table and sat for a while longer in the quiet kitchen, not waiting for anything specific but also not quite ready to go to bed and close the day that had started with surveillance in a Love's truck stop parking lot and ended with him trying to communicate years of accumulated understanding in a message that probably couldn't carry the weight he was asking it to hold. The phone stayed face down on the table, the screen dark and silent, the message delivered but unread, and Darnell thought about how often the important gestures in life happened without witnesses or acknowledgement. How much of what mattered occurred in the spaces between people where connection existed without confirmation, and where the most honest forms of communication were the ones that didn't require response to justify their existence. He picked up the phone eventually, checked one more time to see if the read receipt had appeared, saw that it hadn't, and carried the device upstairs with him, knowing that the lack of response wasn't rejection, but just another form of the careful distance that had defined their relationship for 14 years, and would probably continue to define it, regardless of what truths had finally been spoken or what acknowledgments had been offered in kitchen silence while the rest of the borrowed house slept. 2 days after Darnell sent the message that stayed unread, a letter arrived at the Independence House with no return address and a postmark from Little Rock, Arkansas, the city where Vernon Coswell had died 3 years into a federal investigation that was supposedly winding down, but apparently still had enough momentum to send anonymous correspondence across state lines to people who'd spent 14 years trying to stay invisible. The envelope was plain white, the kind sold in bulk at office supply stores, and Darnell's name and the Independence address were written in careful block letters that looked deliberately impersonal, as if whoever had addressed it wanted to avoid leaving identifying characteristics in their handwriting. He opened it standing in the kitchen while Malik was at school, using a butter knife because he couldn't find scissors and didn't want to walk to another room and risk losing the moment of privacy before anyone else came home. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, with one sentence written in handwriting that looked different from the block letters on the envelope, more natural and less guarded. The kind of script that came from someone who'd stopped worrying about disguising their identity once the envelope was sealed. The sentence read, "Vernon kept records that weren't destroyed when he died, and someone besides the federal agents knows where they are." No signature, no explanation of who'd sent it, or why they thought Darnell needed this information. No instructions about what he was supposed to do with knowledge that felt both urgent and impossibly vague. He read it 3 times, looking for meaning that extended beyond the literal words, trying to understand whether this was a warning or a threat, or just information being passed along by someone who thought he deserved to know that whatever protection Lila's testimony had provided might not be as complete as anyone had believed. The implications spread through his mind in patterns that made his chest tighten. Connections forming between Vernon's death in a Little Rock motel and federal investigations that were still requiring Lila's relocation years after the original events, between records that hadn't been destroyed and people who weren't federal agents who apparently knew enough to send letters that raised more questions than they answered. If Vernon had kept documentation that implicated people beyond those already charged or convicted, if those records contained information about Malik's paternity or custody arrangements, or any of the complicated history that Darnell had been trying to keep private, then the safety he'd been building through silence wasn't safety at all, but just temporary distance from exposure that could arrive whenever someone decided those records were worth pursuing. Subscribe before the past you thought was buried sends proof it's been waiting for you to stop running. He thought about calling Lila, using whatever number she'd given him during their conversation in the Kansas City office, but realized immediately that calling would only confirm he'd received the letter and understood its significance, would create exactly the kind of documented connection that might be dangerous if the wrong people were monitoring communications looking for proof that witnesses were sharing information outside official channels. He thought about destroying the letter, burning it in the kitchen sink, and flushing the ashes down the disposal so no evidence remained that he'd ever received it. But destroying it wouldn't erase what he now knew, and wouldn't change the fact that someone out there possessed records that could reach forward through 14 years of careful construction and dismantle everything he built around Malik's safety and their precarious stability. The weight that settled over him wasn't panic, but something closer to resignation. The understanding that the conversation in the borrowed office hadn't been an ending but just another chapter in a story that kept extending into spaces he'd hoped were finally closed, and that the choice between staying and running that he'd thought he'd resolved by relocating to independence was actually still open, still demanding decisions that would have consequences regardless of which direction he chose. Staying meant waiting to see if whoever sent the letter would follow up with demands or threats or information that would require response. Meant remaining visible in a location where Malik had started to build new routines and friendships that would be disrupted if they moved again. Running meant abandoning the small stability they'd managed to create, meant teaching his son that safety required constant motion and that the past could always reach forward far enough to make staying anywhere feel like a mistake. Darnell folded the letter carefully and slid it into his wallet next to the case reference number the Selena deputy had given him weeks earlier. 2 pieces of paper that represented different moments in an investigation he still didn't fully understand, but was apparently still part of whether he'd chosen involvement or not. He looked out the kitchen window at the street where Malik would be walking home from school in a few hours, at the borrowed house that had started to feel less temporary and more like a place where they might actually stay if circumstances allowed it. And he understood with a clarity that felt like ice water that the circumstances weren't going to allow it, that whatever came next would require choices he wasn't ready to make but wouldn't be able to avoid. And that the past he'd been running from hadn't been running at all but just waiting patiently for him to stop long enough for it to catch up and present bills that had been accumulating interest, while he'd convinced himself that distance and silence were the same thing as freedom,